Hi, Treno.
Hi.
How are you?
Good. Is your guest here?
Not yet. She sent me a message a little bit ago. Said she was on computer support. Could we give her 15 minutes? So. Remember, you're live now, Treno.
Okay, I'll keep my inappropriate language to a minimum.
Thank you. That'll be a change for you.
Yeah, the video can't make it serious. Most people.
You can see it now. Yeah, it's starting. Do you want my? No, yeah, like. Can I give it to you now?
I'm not sure. I know what you're doing.
It's better to do it on time. I have two jobs.
Yeah, but I feel like it's already added to it.
Yeah, I know. Yes, I
Sherry just texted me. She said she just needs another minute. Remember, you're live on the internet right now.
Because I recognize her. Might she be like in the last week or so?
Oh, no.
Oh.
Yeah, it's not
Yeah, I just recognized that woman. I thought that was where she works. That's really cool.
I just so many notes.
Yeah, probably.
Hello. Hello. Hi.
Hi, Sherry. Is that you?
I just found out that the hardware for my webcam has never worked since I bought it, so that's why it doesn't work now. I'm sorry.
We don't have your picture. Oh, no, I guess we do. I guess we're not going to have a picture of you. But we'll survive. Okay. At least you found out what the problem was.
I'm sorry to keep you all waiting. I'm very sorry.
That's all right. High school students don't mind waiting at all.
Oh, sure.
As
Uh-huh.
long as long as they're waiting on my time.
Oh,
and not-
okay.
Can you see them all?
I can. You have a bigger group now at noon, I see.
Yes, these are the really smart kids. You just-
Oh, okay. They slept in this morning. They were smart.
All right. We'll get started like we did this morning. I'll ask a couple of questions, and we'll see what that elicits from the students.
Okay.
First one, could you tell us what happened on the day you last saw your dad?
Yeah, my mom drove my dad to a small airport outside of Waterbury, Connecticut, where we lived, and he took a small plane from there to Bradley Field in Hartford, and then he took a commercial flight to Florida, where he then rented a plane from a CIA cover company and went on another mission to bomb Cuba, which is what he had been doing, only this time he never came back.
What kind of missions was he involved in with Cuba, Sherry?
My father and another gentleman by the name of Alexander Rourke were involved with several other Americans and Cubans trying to overthrow Castro. So my father would, he was a pilot. He had 8 years in the Air Force. He would fly under the radar. They would drop bombs on the Cuban sugar fields or the Shell oil refineries, or they would drop leaflets, propaganda leaflets, so that the people could read them, and they were trying to organize everyone to overthrow Castro once they figured out that Castro was a communist.
Now, was your dad one of these fellows we describe as being somebody who didn't exist, doing things that were not happening as part of the Central Intelligence Agency's plausible?
He was 8 years Air Force, like I said, but he was taken. He left the Air Force and joined the Army Reserve. The Army Reserve is where he was hooked up with the people that were doing the covert operations against Cuba. But the thing is, my father had poison pills. He showed to my family that if he ever got caught, he was to eat the poison.
All right, and how about Alex Rourke, the fellow he met with in Opelika?
Yeah, Alex Rourke came from a prominent family in New York City. His father was the assistant district attorney in New York City. His father-in-law owned a very famous nightclub called the Stork Club, and that was frequented by movie stars and mob, all kinds of shady characters. They had money, they had power, they had influence, yet even their family were locked out of all the information that the government has on my father and Alex.
And you've spent over 30 years, the past 30 years or so, doing what, Sherry?
Well, I started in the mid 80s. I wrote a letter to the CIA, to the FBI, and one to Fidel Castro. Now, Castro never has answered me. I've written him probably 50 times. The FBI, I sent requesting under the Freedom of Information Act information on my father. Within a year, I received 1,200 pages. About a third of them were deleted completely, and the rest were redacted heavily, meaning that if on a typical page, you might have 1 or 2 sentences that were legible. The rest were blacked out. So out of all the 1,200 pages from the FBI, we probably were able to see maybe a third of what they had.
Sherry, can you tell the students what it means that under the Freedom of Information Act, there would be over 1,200 pages on your father?
Well, obviously they were investigating his activities, and this is typical for what happens when someone gets involved in covert operations. You know, one agency doesn't know what the other is doing. And also, the CIA is not supposed to be operating within the confines of our borders. The CIA is supposed to be operating outside of our country. But they were operating inside of our borders, and they were organizing, funding, and supplying men like my father to conduct a secret war against Castro.
And where did you go physically for some of your information? I know you spent time in Miami.
I did. I went to Miami. I still go to Miami to research. I've been down there researching probably 20 different times. Connecticut, obviously, that's where my father was from. New York City. I've traveled to California. Obviously, I've been down to Washington, D.C. and Maryland. I've researched heavily at the National Archives. Yeah, I've traveled all over the country.
And could you tell us, because we bumped into in our studies, some of the people that you ended up meeting on your travels to find out about your father?
Oh yes, my father was working with Frank Sturgis. I don't know if that's one of the names you guys have studied, but he was a Watergate burglar. Jerry Patrick Hemming, he was another that was heavily involved, another American that was heavily involved in the anti-Castro campaign. Marita Lorenz, who was Castro's girlfriend. I've met them all in person. I mean, there are many more, but I've met them all in person. I have video recordings of many of them. I have audio of all of them. And I have over 100,000 pages of documents now in my files.
Okay. Let's see if the students have some questions. Sherry, follow on some of the ones that I had for you.
Okay.
Well, the first question.
Oh, just tell her we are.
I'm Luke.
Hello.
Well, earlier during when we were setting up Google Hangouts, the question was asked. You apparently took your case to court and sued Cuba. Was that an international or a U.S.-based court?
It's actually a Maine court. I won in the Maine court. I have not won federally yet. We are trying to serve Cuba with papers again so that we can bring it to the federal level, but Cuba has been getting very crafty and shifty, and we can't get proof of service back. That, you know, in order to sue someone, you have to serve them with papers telling them that they're being sued, and until you prove to the court that you have proof of service, the court will not allow you to continue, which is what is happening right now. Now, I won a $21 million suit in the state of Maine, which is it's a viable lawsuit. It stands. If the money ever comes through, I will get the money. But we're trying to get it on a federal level because we think we'd have a better chance of succeeding if we were on a federal level.
Hi, I'm Katya.
Hi.
Why would be some reasons that you wouldn't get the money that you want?
Some reasons I wouldn't get the money? Well, when we first started the embargo against Cuba, the United States seized all of the Cuban assets that were in this country. And so there have been millions and millions of dollars that have been sitting in bank for years collecting interest. So there's been billions of dollars it racked up to. But I'm not the first person to sue Cuba. There are several other people ahead of me that sued Cuba, and they were able to access that money. Right now, the United States is saying, the Department of Treasury is saying that those monies have all been spent. But I have resources that tell me that that's not true. I mean, no one wants to give up the money.
Hi, I'm Frieda from Germany. I
Hi.
have a question. Obviously, you traveled kind of like the entire U.S. for getting information about your father. Is there any specific reason why you didn't travel to Cuba to get information?
Well, I did try to travel to Cuba. First of all, I don't speak Spanish. Second of all, I was rather afraid to go to Cuba on my own anyway because, well, my father had been thrown into a Cuban prison. And at one point in time, before my father and his partner Alex were captured, Castro had put out a death warrant, an absentee death warrant, that if they were ever to be caught, they would be killed. So my father was not a favorite person to Castro. I did try to get my senators and Congress people to help me. That didn't work out. And then since I have filed the lawsuit, I really feel it's unsafe for me to go there now.
Okay, yeah.
Hi, I'm Nana from Pakistan.
Hi.
You said you wrote to Castro 50 times. I was wondering what you wrote in your letter, what you asked for.
I asked Castro for a humanitarian plea. At the time when I wrote to him, my father had been missing for 20 years. So I simply asked for a humanitarian plea that I just wanted to know where my father was, and I wanted to have his remains. If he was indeed passed on, I would like to have his remains returned to us so we could have a proper burial. And I sent letters through Canada. I sent letters through different types of mail. I sent letters through individuals out of Miami that had family in Cuba. I tried every single way, but I've tried going through embassies and the State Department. I just can't connect with Castro. He doesn't want to acknowledge it.
Sherry, have you ever been able to talk with anybody from Castro's inner circle about this? Fabian Escalante, for example, or anyone else?
I have talked to a lot of the Cubans, and I hate to say this, but it's true. I am terrible with names, and it's been so long ago that I've spoken with some of them. I'd have to go through my 100,000 pages of files to get you those names. But I did speak with a lot of the Cubans that were involved at the time in these operations, and a lot of them knew my father, had worked with my father. But it's a complete mystery. It's a smaller scale than this big Malaysian flight that just went down, only it's a smaller scale. It's just like they disappeared off the face of the earth. The airplane, no debris was ever found. And the only reason that I believe my father was in a Cuban prison is because I have many reports to that effect.
People who were in prison told you that they saw your dad in prison?
Yes, there were people in prison with my father and Alex that, when they got out, had given reports to the CIA and to Customs, and those reports were either buried or pulled from the files, or they were completely ignored to begin with. Now, under my Freedom of Information Act request, I included 13 government agencies after a while, and Customs was one. Of course, CIA was one from the very beginning, but they have no record of these reports. And I know for a fact that those reports were given because I spoke to the individuals who gave them. So our government our government's hiding it, the Cuban government's hiding it. I'm not sure. I sometimes think they're in cahoots together. I don't think anyone wants the information that my father and Alex would have. I don't think they want that information coming out. I also think that my father disappeared 2 months before the Kennedy assassination, and he was involved with some of those people who were investigated as being assassins in that scenario. So I think those files are buried, if they exist at all.
Go ahead, Edward. She can't quite see you there.
Who are some of the people that your father was involved with that are known to be have some connection, possibly, to the Kennedy assassination?
That would be Frank Sturgis, Jerry Patrick Hemming, Marita Lorenz, Lawrence Hall, Howard Davis, Ed Colby. That's to name a few.
And how did he have connection with those people? Do you know any of the specifics?
Well, I read in a newspaper article, there were a lot of newspaper articles written when my father and Alex first went missing, in the New York Times, the Miami papers, all the way up and down the East Coast, West Coast. So I started a scrapbook, and that's where I gained some of my information about who he was working with.
And what connection did those articles entail your father had with those people?
There were articles that were written before the disappearance about what my father and Alex were doing. They were called the Freedom Fighters. They were dubbed the Freedom Fighters, and there would be articles about, you know, what they were doing as far as dropping leaflets and bombing and trying to overthrow Castro. And they were considered heroes at the time. In the mindset of the American people, they were considered the heroes that were going in and stopping communism that was only 90 miles from our shores. So these people that all worked together were really a very small group of Americans. There were more Cubans involved, but the Americans that got involved were really not that many. So once I got in touch with Frank Sturgis, he was the first one. You know, then of course he related to me several other names, and it just went on from there until I have a whole filing cabinet full of contacts now. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
I have a two-part question that I guess you can answer in any order you want. First off, do you think it's feasible that your father would still be alive after 30 years? And second, do you know if he was involved in anything other than anti-Castro type missions?
Well, my father had been 8 years in the Air Force, so he was involved in the Korean conflict. And do I think my father is still alive? You know, I can honestly say I hope he isn't. I've read accounts of what Cuban prisons are like, and you know, if I really loved my father, I wouldn't want him to have gone through a day of what those men and women have been put through. But there's a part of me that, you know, he's my dad. I'm sure you feel that way about your dad. You know, if something happened to you, just unless you know what happens, it's just really difficult to let go of, and it's difficult for a lot of other people to understand. So it tends to be a very lonely journey when you're on a search of this type. It's so secret there, and there's so many walls up there that are put there to stop you, confuse you. You know, disinformation is given to you. It's just a very confusing mess. But I'm still pushing.
Other questions? Anybody?
Yeah, maybe.
God bless you. Yes?
Just one back for you, if you want to wait a minute. Or...
Yeah, I gotta wait a minute.
Okay, yeah, just let me know.
I'm Gwen. I was just wondering, you said that there was a death warrant out for your father, but then there were people that saw him in jail, so I was wondering if you thought that they carried out that death threat, or if they...
You know, you were cutting in and out. I couldn't hear everything you were saying.
Oh,
You can go forward if you want. You get your share and you go up there if you want.
just, I was wondering if you said that there was a death warrant out for your father, and then that people saw him in jail, so I was wondering if what you thought the Cuban government did once they had captured him, or if you had any more information about that.
The only thing I know about the death warrant was that my father and Alex were sentenced to death in absentia, meaning, of course, they had some kind of a hearing, and my father wasn't there to represent himself. and they were deemed. Well, of course, they were bombing Cuba. You know, I mean, if someone was bombing us, I guess we'd feel the same way. You know, I can understand what the people of Cuba probably felt at the time if they were pro-Castro. But when Castro came into power, he was supposed to be pro-democracy, and not long after he assumed power, he associated with the Soviet Union and became more of a communist state. So that's why there was so much effort put into trying to get Castro out.
Yeah.
Okay, my question was, which kind of impression did you get of Frank Sturgis, and was there ever a time when you and him talked about anything other than the Cuban Missile Crisis in connection maybe to Lee Harvey Oswald?
Oh yes, I have several video, mostly audio of Frank Sturgis, but our conversations pretty much revolved around what operations they were doing out of Florida, and he flatly denies that he was in Dallas or that he had anything to do with the JFK assassination. But then again, every one of them that I interviewed that had been accused of being involved in the assassination, they're not going to admit it anyway.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
This is kind of a little different of a question.
Okay.
I'm Abby. When you were growing up, like, how much did you know about what was going on?
Well, I didn't know. I was only 7 when my dad left, and the only thing I knew was that he was to return in 5 days, and he didn't. But then the newspaper articles started coming out about 2 Americans, being missing, and so I started a scrapbook and I started to collect information. And when I got old enough, I wrote to a psychic, a very famous psychic in the 60s. Her name was Jeannie Dixon. I remember writing to her when I was about 12, seeing if she could find anything out about my dad. That was my first attempt, I guess. But it wasn't until I was 28, which was the same age my dad was when he disappeared, that I started writing letters and started actively looking for him. And one of the things that has been very difficult is that there was no information to give, and it was like our family almost became living in some kind of a bubble or a void. It's like we never really talked about my dad. No one really knew what to say. So I feel like I kind of grew up in the dark about what my dad was about, and obviously I was curious. So when I started looking for him, I didn't realize it was going to be 30 years and 100,000 pages later. I thought, I was very naive. I thought when I wrote my first Freedom of Information Act request to the CIA and the FBI, I was so confident when I dropped those envelopes in the mailbox that the government would do what they're supposed to do. They would just give me the answer. I didn't realize I would have to fight all of my life to get the little bit of information that I have now.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for your question.
Hi, I'm Jack. I was just wondering, because you said you met with us up on like what you guys talked about and whatnot.
Can you say that again?
The psychic that you got in contact with.
Well, she just wrote me a letter. She wrote me a letter back and said that she couldn't pick up on my father's vibes.
Oh yeah.
And actually, I've gone to psychics over the years and asked the same question. I haven't really left any rock unturned. I've really, it's hard to explain to you how much of my life this has taken up. But any suggestions that have ever come my way, I've done them. I've gone through senators, congresspeople, embassies. Just it's just such a strange thing to me that people can disappear off the face of the earth and no one knows. It doesn't make sense to me. Someone knows somewhere.
Sherry, could you tell the students about how free the Freedom of Information Act is for American citizens?
Sure. Like I said, I fully expected that when I wrote those letters that I would be getting some answers from my government that would help me, but no, that wasn't the case. I had a friend of mine who was an attorney, and he did all the work for me pro bono. And then in order to interview some of these characters that were involved with my dad, some of them, like Jerry Patrick Hemming, for instance, was in federal prison. So I couldn't go in to see him. I had to hire a private investigator. So then I became my own private investigator. I am a private investigator now. So I've been able to get into the federal prisons to interview, like Orlando Bosch was one of them in Miami. So, you know, I sat down and did an estimate on how much it would probably have cost me to do all of that, plus all the travel and the expense and the court expenses. I'm sure it's close to $1 million by now. And I still don't have the answers that I set out to get.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Any other questions?
I have a question.
Yeah.
I'm Claire. I was just wondering, you said you wrote to the FBI and the CIA. Did the CIA respond to you at all?
The CIA did respond by saying that they had no information and they had no files on my father. But as I took 9 government agencies to court under the Freedom of Information Act, and the CIA did come up with some files, but then they said they would neither confirm nor deny the existence of my father in relation to their organization. That's a standard answer from the CIA. They will neither confirm nor deny.
Sherry, could you also talk about your dad's income, his paychecks, etc.?
Yes, my father was getting paid $5,000 in cash per flight, and he was given that cash by Alexander Rourke, his partner. And I know this to be true because I interviewed my mother. I have her on tape and have the transcription of that tape. But also, I have some old letters that I found where she wrote home to her mother about the money my father was bringing home, how much it was, who gave it to him, and why he was being paid. He was being paid to go to Cuba and do anti-Castro operations, and he was being paid by Alexander Rourke. And $5,000 in 1963, what did you say, Bill, how much that would be today?
Probably somewhere between 50 and 70,000.
So that was a chunk of change.
Plus expenses, I assume, Sherry.
Yes, you know, they were making homemade bonds. My mother tells me a story of how she drove from Connecticut to New Jersey with my dad, and they met this Cuban. The only way they could find his house was that he had a red mailbox, and it was a little bungalow, and they went down there and picked up some homemade bombs and put them in the back of the trunk and drove home with them. And there was another time that my father had said that he had landed his small plane right next to the Air Force One in Palm Beach, Florida, and he was loaded up with bombs and ammunition and all that for another mission, and nobody bothered him. He was right there next to the president's plane.
Oh, hi, I'm Rashka. Out of curiosity, are there any radio records between your dad and the people co-oping the flight?
I have the full set of transcripts from the FAA. My father, Alex, and they had another person on board who was supposed to be a double agent. He was Cuban. So I have the transcript from their communications with my father, but then they lost communication at some point and never heard from again.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Anybody else, or should we let Sherry off the hook? Yes, go ahead.
Hi, I'm Daniel. How often did he go on missions to Cuba?
Well, like I said, I was 7 years old, so I can't really answer that precisely. I do know that from the newspaper articles and the research that I've done, they were in September, my father disappeared, and from April to the time of his disappearance, I know that they were down there probably 4 or 5 different times in that short a period of time.
Yeah.
And then Alex Rourke would also go on speaking engagements to raise money for these operations, also to top off the money that was being given to them by the government. And corporations, big corporation was involved in this too, because they had assets in Cuba that they were losing. There was a lot of money. There was a lot of money behind it. A lot of secrets, though. I'm telling you, it's amazing to me how many people that I have talked to that do not want to talk about it. They're afraid to talk about it, and they've totally backed off away from me. I've had one family in particular tell me they felt their life was in danger by being in contact with me, so they wouldn't have any contact anymore.
Sherry, about that money, were you able in any way, or has anybody in any way been able to tie Alexander Rourke to other people who might have been supporting him? Or do you suspect that it was entirely his own money that he was spending on these operations?
No, Alex Rourke wasn't working on his own. He was in the FBI for a short while, but he was an intelligence agent in the Army. And he had, like I say, his family was pretty prominent. They had good connections. And like one time my mother went with my dad to New York City, and my father had this checkbook. It didn't belong to him, but he had to go to all these different banks and get signatures in order to get this money. So, yeah, I don't know.
All right, thank you.
Yep.
I have a question.
Sure.
I'm Kaylin. Have you gone to anyone who talks to spirits or anything? Because if your dad has passed on, wouldn't he reach out to you, knowing all the work you've done for him?
You're asking me if I've gone to a spiritualist?
Yeah.
Yeah, I have. I've gone to several. Like I say, I'm not opposed to any suggestions at all, but I've never been able to get any answer.
Thank you.
You're welcome. All I ask of you as students is to think about what you would do if you were 7 years old and your dad just disappeared, and under such circumstances. A lot of people think that I should let this go, that I'm living in the past. There are people that feel that way, and I understand. But I think unless you actually live through something like this, it's difficult for others to understand the importance of having closure. He's my dad. I still love him dearly, and the thought of him rotting in a Cuban prison breaks my heart. So, I really feel very strongly that our government, I don't think we have the worst government in the world. I think we have a nice, good country. I think our government needs to straighten up a little bit. And the way I look at it is, if they had all the money and all the resources and the power to create this secret war against Cuba, which in 1963 the CIA was the largest employer in the state of Florida at the time. They employed that many people in the fight against Cuba, and it was under the pseudonym of J.M. Wave. If they had all this money to set up all these operations, set up all the dummy companies, buy all the planes, the ammunition, all that, why can't they take care of the families of these men that disappeared? I mean, we could sign a non-disclosure agreement or whatever. So I just think it's inhumane that the government will not bring some answers to the families, because there's more than my family. There are other American families that are in the same position, and it's been devastating on some of these families. Some of these people, they're about my age. I know one of them in particular. She's been in and out of a mental institution all of her life. It's been really hard on the families. I just think it's unfair, and it's un-American. That's my opinion.
On the topic of the other families, have you talked to any families or learned of any people who've gotten more information than you have, or gotten more answers than you?
Yes, there was one woman. Her name is Janet Weininger. Her father was one of the Bay of Pigs pilots, and she was able to actually get a stack of photographs of her father, who Castro kept in a coffin that had a glass top on it. Now this sounds really crazy, but I saw the pictures. Had a glass top on it, and they would pull the casket out and desecrate on it. But she was able to finally somehow get her father's remains back home to have a proper burial, and she also sued Castro, and she did get the money. And now the other families, I started an organization called Forgotten Families of the Cold War, and trying to organize us together, thinking we would have a bigger and more powerful voice, especially in Washington. But the problem is like I say, these families have been damaged, and it's been really hard for these children of the missing fathers to trust. And I found that it was easier organizing the group of us. That part was rather easy to get us together, but then it just seemed there was a lot of distrust among the people themselves, and so everyone finally just went their own way. And I think it's because they feel a need to have some control over their story, and I understand that.
Have you ever gone to like really high up in the government, like Congress or even to the president?
Oh yes, I've written. Right now, I'm working with both of my senators in the state of Maine. And about 10 years ago, the Veterans Administration finally, through the help of Senator Collins in Maine, they missing in action, and they gave him a small stone. We had a ceremony. The highest-ranking officer in the state came, General Tinkham. Congressman Michaud had written a very nice statement to be read. The governor at the time was Governor Baldacci. He wrote a proclamation proclaiming it Jeffrey Sullivan Forgotten Families of the Cold War Day, September 23rd. So I have had help. Senator Cohen, before, when he was the senator in Maine, he helped me, and his office called Collins' office to get them to try to expedite my request for my father's medals.
Huh. That's interesting.
But it seems like no matter how high up, I've written to every single sitting president since 1984. I wrote to every member of the Iran-Contra committee. I've written to every Secretary of State. I could go on and on. I won't bore you with it. It just seems that they get so far, and then that big black wall of silence just comes down, and they just can't go any further.
Anything else? Well, Sherry, thank you. Yeah, do you have something?
What I wanted to say was, it's nice to see that there's so many people that actually are interested in a subject matter like this, and if anyone ever wants to contact me, Bill, feel free to give my contact information out if any of you have any further questions or have any interest, learning more. I share my files with anyone who's interested.
It's very generous of you. We all heard you, so we'll see if anybody here is interested.
Okay.
All right.
Well, good luck to all of you.
All right. And get yourself a good camera someday.
I'm trying. I'm trying. Okay.
All right. Thank you very much, Sherry.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Best of luck.